Back in the 90s, the console wars were in full effect. Never again would console wars reach heights like these ever again, as that sort of marketing were a sign of the times. As Sony asserted its dominance by ridiculing Microsoft's E3 DRM announcements, and Nintendo's fans kept begging for everything to be ported over to the Nintendo Switch. Wait, let's try that again. As Sega bowed out of the competition, Microsoft jumped into the new generation incredibly early and got the entire audience.
Hey, you're just mad because I'll be able to do something with my fucking guitar in hands that you'll never be able to achieve in your entire life, kid. So yeah, you're gay.
Only burning them away shortly after. Inspired by this, Sony unleashed a barbecue, and Nintendo got fun of for being casual, while casuals kept buying Wiis in such amounts that it broke every Wait, okay, hold on, I got this. In the 90s, video game companies learned the real power of how to create a place for yourself on the market by taking the opposite side to your competition. Much like Coke versus Pepsi, Christina Aguilera versus Britney Spears, Utada Hikaru versus Hamaski Ayumi, Marvel versus DC, and WCW versus WWF, we had Sega versus Nintendo. Looking back on it now, it sounds crazy that a character like Sonic the Hedgehog could have been the edgy alternative to something that had already proven itself as a mainstay. Sonic, especially the classic version, is a cutesy mascot that, despite his main characteristics being the spikes on his back, still has that soft, rounded look to him that makes him look cute and safe for kids. But back in the day, compared to the clean and well-behaved image of Mario, he was a rougher, edgier mascot with an attitude. Sega intentionally placed themselves opposite to what Nintendo was going for, and even made most of their marketing about the difference between the two. Nintendo, on their part, had essentially done the same before this. Long before Sega geared themselves to be the opposite to Nintendo, Nintendo themselves went to great lengths to prove that they were the opposite of Atari, after Atari crashed the American console market in the 80s. Nintendo managed to bring that market back through smart marketing, mostly aimed at store owners to trick them into allowing another video game system on their shelves, pretending that they were toys. It didn't take long for that bit to end up with both store owners and consumers trusting Nintendo, and only Nintendo, as a maker of video game platforms worth selling. And it took Sega similar efforts and tricking to get both store owners and consumers to trust them as an alternative to Nintendo, getting the man who marketed Barbie to a point of becoming a household name to do the same for them. This is likely also why the NES didn't take off to the same extent in a lot of Europe, since all the marketing and appearance of the system was based around tricking American stores into thinking they weren't a video game platform, and also why Sega didn't struggle to get a foothold the same way that they did in the US. This is probably also why the Super Nintendo design was basically just the rounded Super Famicon's design, complete with the colored buttons instead of the American Super Nintendo Entertainment System brick with purple buttons. Because this sort of trickery didn't seem that honest in Europe, so it just didn't work as well. I've always wondered about the representation of the European video game market online, because I do remember all the kids that had Nintendos when I was a kid, with maybe one rich kid owning a Genesis and a CDI. Nobody here had PCs until much later, and pretty much all sources I find talking about Sega's early European success, Nintendo's failure, and the mainstay position of PCs that early comes from England exclusively. Though they do tend to get most of the smaller releases exclusively, while mainland Europe is left out, so it wouldn't surprise me if they're just that big a cut of the gaming market on their own. Anyway, marketing a product as a work of quality is one thing, but when the entire identity of a product is so encapsulated by another brand's existence, the marketing around a competitor starts to become about that competitor and the culture surrounding it. This doesn't appeal to you? Then come over to our side. We aren't like that, we're way cooler. These days, this sort of marketing still exists, of course, but usually to a much less aggressive extent than in the past. Unless someone does something so aggressively stupid, you can just take a free shot at them to wink at your audience and go, hey, we want no part of that, just like you. Like when Microsoft wanted to take the Xbox One online only with incredibly restrictive DRM for all physical purchases, and Sony came swinging for the fences immediately after. Or when everyone came together to allow their players to enjoy crossplay with one another except Sony, and both Phil Spencer and Reggie went, dude, what the fuck? You sometimes still see people misunderstand the era we're in and open marketing on big attacks on the competition while their competitor is still in a positive spotlight. Like Cliffy B's dumb statements about Overwatch while making his own team-based class shooter. Or Randy Pitchford's dumb competitive marketing on Twitter towards Overwatch. What if you have no main competitor or rival to fight for the audience of though? What if you have to fight on your own merits, but you don't have the confidence in your product to claim quality? Or worse, you tried it and it didn't work well enough to your liking. There's a new kind of marketing for that. It's been getting more and more popular as time goes on, and it's not the greatest. In fact, pretty much every use I've seen of it, it ends up tanking the product sales almost entirely, and there's enough cases now where there's nothing wrong with the game or the positioning on the market surrounding them to blame anything but the marketing. Disclaimer, we are going to touch on politics. This video is not political in nature. You can make America great again or Pokemon Go to the polls all you want. I don't want part in that. There was a really awkward moment in the recent E3 where someone from Bethesda brought up killing Nazis and the audience cheered in such unbridled open bloodlust. You could see the discomfort on the face of his co-host. Realizing that the marketing of his games didn't just instill a level of hype for a piece of entertainment to consume, it sparked a response in an audience that had trouble keeping the blurry lines between reality and fiction apart. Now, I'm not going to argue the semantics between what is and isn't a Nazi, as that's besides the point. What I'm going to talk about, though, is that the Wolfenstein Nazis are the ones the audience was thinking of with their response.
And you beat the living fuck out of those Nazis.
Whereas yet, Wolfenstein 2 bombed in terms of sales, something that was actually surprising coming off the success of the previous games. Bethesda had sent a lot of good games to die that year with little to no marketing, and most of them actually sold within the same ballpark as Wolfenstein 2. Even on launch, it didn't do too well, despite most early impressions of the game being fairly positive. And usually the initial response, the quality itself doesn't matter, it's usually the tale afterwards that really matters. So how did this happen? Because the marketing did the worst thing possible it could have done. It tried to tie itself to modern day politics, attacking one side of the political spectrum. Now you can argue about attacking the wrong side of a political spectrum because the other buys more games, but I think that's besides the point, as we'll get into later. The way political ideologies are generally represented within modern media is through the filter of absolutes, black and white, left or right, and by insulting one side, you insult half the people who hold a political viewpoint, alienate the people who don't want to get involved with any political viewpoint, and unnerve the people with similar viewpoints as the ones you favor but aren't as extreme as you are. It is a form of marketing that stands to lose more than it gains, and while outlets that favor a certain political leaning are more likely to give you coverage if you openly agree with them all the way, that doesn't automatically mean you're going to convert that attention into sales. In a similar sense, you have games that market themselves using outrage from the same outlets made by edgy developers, hoping to make a quick buck on purchases from people opposed to the viewpoints of those media outlets. The media outlets will cover them so they can be outraged at something, and driving outrage one way or another gets them views to their site. Most of those games end up not selling that well either, or if they do, it only takes them so far unless they actually have something to offer, which the majority do not. Even just giving people simple match 3 games and some lewds is enough. And most developers don't even offer that much when they openly play into outrage culture. I'm honestly not even sure what there is to gain for people to jump onto the political points time and time again when it rarely leads to sales that otherwise might not have existed. It is hard to argue that a game would have sold as much as it did without bringing itself into the spotlight, but considering the ones that end up selling well enough tend to at least be crafty enough to get there, I wouldn't be surprised if they could find ways to sell their game without that use, possibly selling even more. For some, it's a foot in the door in a desperate competitive market, but for the ones where it isn't, I really have questions as to why they'd attempt to drag people's belief systems through the mud just to get the attention they already have, since all it does is get themselves dirty in the process. It's hard not to see this as a problem of not having confidence in your product. So you try to align yourself with people who should purchase your product, or else they're part of them, that evil group that you don't like. People generally don't buy products just for that though. They'll signal boost you, they'll try to help you find an audience that is more interested in you than they are, and they likely will hope for your success, but they're not part of the group unless you deliver them what they want. Because that, in the simplest terms, is what the purchase of a game is. Paying a publisher to get the product that you want for your personal enjoyment. It's not a passage to political achievement or fulfillment, and not a completion of your values. It's a form of entertainment, and one that is ill-suited to convey the things these marketing angles try to position them as. I think to some degree, people who use these tactics must know this themselves and just do it in the hopes of distracting from problems with their product the actual target audience would quickly find. This audience would still find these issues, but then get shouted down as part of the opposition that's been created. The recent arguments about the new Battlefield game not being historically accurate is a good example of this. While yes, there currently are people legitimately throwing a fit about it, the way that this started feels intentional, calculated, and directly instigated. EA is currently under a lot of fire regarding loot boxes and brought a lot of negative attention towards the entire gaming industry because of the practices employed in Battlefront, as well as a lot of the negative attention within the gaming circles about similar practices taken to further extremes with their sports games. One of the things that a lot of the more die-hard fans of Battlefield noticed was the shift in the presentation in the new Battlefield, as cosmetics are more of a thing now than they previously were, as the game is moving away from its previous, admittedly obnoxious unlock system, gating weapons by time and money, to a new one locking cosmetics behind this. At the very least, EA and DICE have responded to the problems people have with these cosmetics, and they've said that they're dialing it back down, so at least that's good. Knowing EA though, they're not going to let go of a way to make more sales post-game launch, and a system focusing on internal cosmetics is likely what they'll keep moving forward with to some degree, possibly turning it back up after it's been normalized. Which is why it felt so absolutely calculated that all the marketing materials and trailers focused on a female character in a game that lets you play as a male or female, as they'd likely expected the initial outrage about the cosmetics and wanted to shift the conversation to something they felt that they could control. It's shitty, but it's the new way marketing seems to go these days. We'll see if Battlefield can become an exception to the rule, or like most attempts that market mostly through political opposition baited out of people, it just serves to alienate both sides. It's a shame because a bunch of the gameplay that I've seen actually makes it look like an alright game, but now it's covered in the stigma of this conversation that it appears to have invited themselves to steer away from the loot box controversy. What's even sadder about this is that recent statements from higher-ups at EA brought up that Battlefront 2 was a mistake, and that their other titles, like the sports ones, have nothing wrong with their format, even though the sports games are a lot worse about their inclusion of loot box systems, implying the problem about Battlefront was that they got caught. No wonder they'd rather invite a political media circus to avoid direct talk about criticism of their monetization schemes in Battlefield. And how did that go over again? Oh yeah, that's not looking very good, is it? Video games aren't exclusive to this either. In the sphere of movies, these kinds of things were used to try and get people to see the last Ghostbusters movie, even trying to slander the angry video game nerd because he politely told his audience, who knew how big a fan he was of the original movies, and would have endlessly asked him if he would review it, that he wasn't going to review the movie because he had no interest in it. Marvel, in terms of comic books, they're overtly political because their biggest opposition, DC, isn't doing all that well either, so there isn't much to rally behind with that rivalry anymore. It's interesting when you contrast this to the movies, which tend to shy away from political motivations for a safer image most of the time, because the movies are way too successful to bother with this kind of marketing technique. Now, Marvel has always been political in nature, make no mistake about that, but it used to be more in tune with its own audience, and have more of a point to it, rather than making it feel like the pages are shouting down at you. It's even more interesting when put next to Star Wars, which isn't doing too hot and immediately started doubling down on making things political, making it even more unpleasant to talk about it than it already was. At this point, the only people who care about Star Wars are people paid to market their movies, and those creepy clickbaiters on YouTube who keep putting the face of the woman in charge of the franchise as the thumbnail for their political rants. Those guys are probably the most loyal crowd modern Star Wars has gotten out of this. Then this works better for companies making their image about a rival company then, right? At least they got some success out of this. But well, it'd be dishonest to say that it worked out all that well for those companies either. When you look at WCW versus WWF, WWF nearly went under in the middle of that war thanks to WCW's competition and people wanting something different from them. But then the rug got pulled out from under WCW when their momentum started to slow down and their funding got cut. When the rivalry between WCW and WWF wasn't enough to draw an audience, WCW created a fake company in NWO to compete against itself in brand, with mostly people representing WWF originally playing up their rivalry within their own company and making the NWO the biggest thing ever. It didn't take too long until this had run its course with nowhere to go. Some people believe they could have still turned it around if they kept going, but the company had always been a money sink and only an insane person would allow it to continue endlessly, as the people in charge were incompetent egomaniacs. If it had kept going, WWF could have completely been whittled away and WCW would have still had the plug pulled sooner or later. The competition didn't make things sustainable for either side, even though it drove the attendance records through the roof for both of them. Wrestling would still have existed to this day without those two, but it's still strange to think how WCW was legitimately the hottest company on the face of the planet and then didn't exist anymore within just a small number of years. Sega versus Nintendo. Just look at where the two are now. There are more factors at play here, but the shift that really ended it all was the third major competitor entering the market with Sony, which is almost sad because Sega was the one who encouraged Sony to go all the way with their attempt at getting into the console market after Nintendo screwed them over with the Philips CDI instead. And they were allowed to get into the market because Sega had opened up the market for other competitors to come in. Who even knows where things would have ended up if Sega continued their really bad hardware practices alongside Nintendo pushing cartridges for way too long. But the moment that real competition showed up, Sega ended up bowing out.
$2.99.
Britney Spears versus Christina Aguilera. One got dirty while keeping most of her integrity and audience, releasing one of her most beloved clean pop songs due to being highly affirmative with Beautiful afterwards. The other shaved her head and had a fall from grace, but at least her son is Frieza. Hamasaki Ayumi versus Utada Hikaru. Well, one is going deaf after having lost her hearing in one side a long time ago, and the other is mostly known for having a bunch of her songs in Kingdom Hearts games. I don't know which one is worse, honestly. Anyway, this was AboveUp. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to see more like this, please leave a like or a comment, maybe even subscribe, and yeah, this was a fun video to do because I actually wrote most of the script a couple of months ago, and all I really had to change was not making the EA segment speculative because it actually happened. It's really weird how I basically told the future. It's a shame I didn't put the video up in time. It would have been fun to go back and go, ha, see, I told you so. But yeah, this video was brought to you by the people supporting me on Patreon, who you see scrolling on the screen right now. If you'd like to become one of the scrolling boys on the screen in future videos, you can head over to patreon.com/aboveup. And yeah, I'll see ya.